All right, and good afternoon. This is Dr. Stubblefield with review for chapter 20 of Greek. Hope you all are doing well. Make sure to get your quizzes in on time. Make sure to let me know if you have any problems or questions. We're advancing in the course about a week at a time, and I'm making each week available to you basically a week at a time. It is raining up here in Jackson. I'm not sure what the weather is where you are, but it's a perfect day to study Greek. So we're looking at chapter 20. And I want to just go over this quickly with you. Your quiz this week will be on chapter 20. So it would be wise for you if you're having trouble. This is a good chapter to play catch up on. If you've been having trouble, this is a good break from the memorization requirements of the course and a good chance for you to catch up. I think chapter 20 is a very doable chapter, but it does introduce some things that are going to make memorization work a little more challenging for you. So let's talk about verbal roots. You can see this on page 208. That's where it begins. Page 208, chapter 20, verbal root patterns. So this far, what you've been learning about is the present, present middle, present passive, and future active, future middle, future passive forms. All right, so or rather future and future middle. I don't think you've done future passive yet. These are not that difficult, and you've been building your verb forms you've been building your verb forms on the present tense stems. So the easiest one we look at is luo. Luo, you've been doing present active indicative luo, lues, lue, luam, lueta, lu, lucy. Future, you've been luso, luces, luce, lusam, and lucete, lususi. Okay, so that's fairly simple. You just chop off the endings and then attach the new endings to the stem. Okay, but a lot of times the present tense stem is not the actual stem of the verb. A lot of times the stems of other verbs are modified in the present. So in a lot of cases, when you go to make when you go to do verbs in other tenses, or you see a present tense stem, the actual verb root is different than what appears in the present tense. So the only way you really kind of understand that and know how to expect that and what the words mean, because sometimes the spellings are so different when it changes tense. Sometimes the spellings are so different that you're not able to recognize what the word is, because it's not a new word. It's a word you've already memorized. It's a very common word, but it is spelt so differently than what you might expect, because the verb stem, the actual verb stem, is very different than what you might expect in the present tense. Mouse talks about this, has a nice little chart, page 209, talking about the Greek verb ballo. Ballo in the present is spelled B-A-L-L-O, or we'd say beta, alpha, lambda, lambda, omega. So when you go to make, when you go to build the verbs in the future, the root is not beta, alpha, lambda, lambda, it's beta, alpha, lambda, which is a different spelling, right? So you wouldn't anticipate that based on what you've learned so far. So the point of showing you that is often that it is the case that verb roots, verb stems are different than you might expect in the present tense. Sometimes they're modified. Now he gives you a bunch of categories for how to understand this. I'll let you read those. It's pretty straightforward though. I mean, he talks about the different patterns, and Mounce is really good about supplying like rules to memorize. Just my experience in this case, I think you have to memorize just as many rules as you do the actual verbs. So I don't really think it's that helpful to memorize 20 rules when you could just memorize like 15 verbs. But Mouse is trying to give you a system to work with. I think he's really into that, but I don't think that's really that helpful. I'm not going to ask you to remember the 4 different patterns of ways to build roots. I think this is kind of, me personally, the way it works for me, the best way on this kind of things is you just have to learn this stuff. You have to learn to recognize the verbs, and you have to learn to recognize different tense forms and verb stems. There are some verbs that do this a lot, and you just get used to it over time. So it's just good to go ahead and commit those to memory. He does give you some common examples when verbs just have different roots when you're in the present, and then they do it in like the future, or potentially you learned yet the past tense, the aorist. And the only way, in my experience, you're going to be able to tell, if it has a totally different spelling in another tense, you just have to learn. You have to learn that root. So the best example is erchomai. Erchomai is a very common verb. It means to go, we go, I go, excuse me. Well, it totally changes completely. Looks nothing like erchomai in the future. Eleothesomai. I mean, that's a totally different verb, eleosomai, than erchomai. No way you can recognize that unless you just memorize it. So there's some you have to just memorize. Pattern 3 talks about page 210 is liquid verbs. Now this is an important category because oftentimes you have to learn to recognize that a verb is in the future tense, not in the present. And sometimes the only difference, particularly in liquid stem verbs, is the spelling of the verb. So for example, if you know the verb meno in the present, meno, mu, epsilon, nu, omega, that means I go. Meno with a circumflex, an accent mark, means I will go. And the circumflex is there because of the way you build future tense verbs with liquid stem verbs. When you do that, you have a liquid stem, you supply the tense formative is epsilon sigma, then your personal endings. The sigma leaves, epsilon and omega crash together and form the omega. You can see that depicted on page 211. So liquid stem verbs have different rules when they switch tenses from present to future stems. So you can see more about that. Now on your quiz, you do need to understand the different types of consonants that make up liquid verbs. So you can see that page 211. And you need to understand the parts that go into making these verbs. Because future, here's a point, future tenses of liquid verbs have different, has a different pattern for building the verb forms. It's different than present tense stem verbs, present tense verbs. All right. He goes talk about the liquid. It's very similar. No huge surprises for the liquid middle. Nothing really surprising there. Once you get the rules down, you should be fine. And then he does talk about pattern 4. This is interesting. There are some verbs that end with very similar sort of endings. And you can start to anticipate what the actual verb stem is when you recognize these sorts of verbs that have shared endings. Verbs that end, for example, in idzo, like for example, baptizo is a dental verb. Baptizo ends with the zeta. Baptizo is zota. And in the actual stem of the verb is not baptiz. It's a different stem. So the idzo, adzo, there's other verbs that end with aso, alpha, sigma, sigma, omega, and those verbs usually have a different verbal stem pattern than you might expect. So you have to kind of learn to recognize those forms. Mounting wants to give you a bunch of rules. I don't think it's worth memorizing all the rules. I think you just need to understand and recognize those stem, those verbal endings, and then you kind of should expect when it has that kind of strange ending, aso, idzo, adzo, that the verbal stem is going to be different than, again, for like that baptizo, it's not baptizo, it's baptid. That's the verb stem. And he gives you some other examples there on page 214. So worth mentioning. All right. So for your quiz, what we all want to know, right? For your quiz, oh, can't minimize. Okay, I won't do that. For your quiz, you need to be ready for Vocabulary. You really need to know your vocabulary this week. It's going to be really important for you. You need, I already told you about the 4 parts of a liquid future active verb. You're going to need to know that because that's different. You need to be able to understand that. You should be able to reproduce some of the roots of the verbs detailed in this chapter. To be able to recognize that the root of the verb is something different than you might expect. So you want to make sure that you understand those. Then that master verb chart, the master indicative verb chart, you see that on page 217. I'm going to ask you to reproduce that. So you're going to need to understand that and how to do it. All right. And then last, there's going to be some parsing as always and some little bonus points this week. So hang in there, see what you can do. And I'm excited to see how you move along. All right. I'm not going to go over your chapter with you this week, although I think it would be good if you do that and have any problems, questions, you need to let me know as soon as possible. Exercise 20, Greek's only going to get harder. So hang in there. Let me know if I can help you in any way. And text, call, write, email, send a telegram, send a carrier pigeon. I'd love to hold on to one of those and pull that little message out of its foot. You ever seen that? Messenger pigeon? It's incredible. All right, I'll talk to you later. Let me know how you're doing. Thanks. Bye.